Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey, and today I'm going to be doing another sew along for one of my patterns, the Byrdie button up. So I actually have a sew along here on the channel for the Byrdie button up, but it was among my first handful of videos that I released on my YouTube channel when I first started doing videos. And I was still kind of figuring out my filming setup, my lighting setup, and I feel like a lot of the details in that video got kind of lost because of poor lighting and poor staging of all of the shots. So I've been wanting to redo that video for a long time, and I also want to make a new Byrdie button up out of some fabric that I've had in my stash for years. Now this is technically a quilting cotton because I got it in the quilting section at Joann Fabrics years ago, and I was gonna make a quilt and I never got around to it because apparently quilting's just not my thing. So anyway, normally I would advise against using a quilting cotton for most garment sewing projects just because the drape is typically not that great. It's a little too crisp, a little too stiff. It doesn't really hang well. Anyway, but this is actually pretty soft. It's just like a little railroad stripe, kind of pinstripe cotton, and I think this will work out well for a Byrdie button up. I also think this pattern is just gonna be nice for a sort of wear with everything Byrdie button up, which is why I love my linen versions so much. They're so easy to style. I can just kind of throw them on. I feel a little bit more put together. So I think a pinstripe version is gonna be a really nice addition to my wardrobe. Now the Byrdie button up comes in two versions. Version A is just a very basic button up shirt, and version B is a button up shirt with a series of tucks across the bodice on the front. And today I'm going to be making version A, just the very basic version of this pattern. It also has two collar options. One is your standard, button up collar, and then the other one is just a stand collar, so basically a band around the neckline. And I'll put a link to the pattern in the description so that you can get all of the pattern details, including sizing, yardage, everything you need to know to get started on this project. Now this is an intermediate project, and with a project like this, I do recommend taking your time because there are a lot of little kind of finicky details with a button-up shirt, which I don't really mind, but with projects like this, I like to kind of space it out over a few days. And to be honest, I could make, not trying to like pat myself on the back or toot my own horn here, but I could make one of these shirts in a day, but it's more stressful when I do it that way. So I typically like to kind of space it out a little bit so that I can really dive into the details and enjoy the process a little bit more, because it can be a little stressful, especially if you're new to sewing a project like this. So today, all I'm gonna do is cut my fabric. And if I feel good after that and I wanna keep going, I might start sewing it, but I'm just gonna focus on that one thing for today. And it's pretty wrinkly. I'm gonna need to iron it. Well, maybe not. Actually, you know what? Well, yeah, I probably do. I'm probably gonna iron it a little bit and get some of the wrinkles out because it's been folded for a long time. I'm going to be using these little heat soluble pins to trace all my pattern pieces before I cut them out. This is just personal preference. I really love these pins. It makes it a lot easier for me to kind of get everything positioned just the way I want it. And you also want to make sure to clip your notches for each version. So for areas where there's a different notch to clip for the different versions, I've got those labeled. So since I'm making version A, I want to make sure that I mark and clip the notch for version A. I'm also going to lengthen the bodice by about 2 inches because I like having a little bit longer shirt. When I designed this pattern, I thought the length that I created would be good for tucking in, which I still think is good, but most of the time I wear mine untucked, and I kind of like it to fit a little bit like a tunic. You can either slash and spread the pattern apart and then tape extra paper in between there, but I'm just gonna actually do this kind of on the fly and trace it out. So I've marked the top of the arm side here. I'm gonna go ahead and mark down to that lengthen shorten line on the pattern. Just draw that side seam there. So I'm gonna bring that down a couple inches. Make sure I've got the fold lined up here with the edge, since this piece is cut on the fold. And then I will mark the bottom here. And I'm just going to kind of true this line here along the side seam. Now do the same thing when I cut out the front bodice. So I've got two sleeves here. They are mirrored. I've got the button placket and interfacing for the button placket. I've got the front bodice, again, two pieces for the front bodice mirrored and some interfacing for part of the placket on the front bodice. I've got a back bodice which is cut on the fold, so you can see that there. I've got the collar, and I've got two of these. This is also cut on the fold, but there's two there. I've got interfacing for one side of the collar. I've got the collar stand, interfacing for one side of the collar stand. I've got my two cuffs, sleeve cuffs, and I've got two pockets. So I think I am gonna go ahead and interface the pieces before I call it a day. All right, it is the next day, and it's kind of a gloomy day today, which is actually a great day for sewing because I feel less guilty about not leaving the house and just staying holed up in my sewing room working on my project. So yesterday I got everything cut out, got everything interfaced, and today I'm gonna start assembling the bodice. So there are two ways that you can sew the placket on the front bodice. If you have a fabric that is essentially the same on the front and the back, you can just do a fold over placket because it already has a grown on placket in the pattern piece. But if you have a fabric that has a distinct front and back, you're gonna wanna do what's called a sewn on placket. So on the pattern piece for the front bodice, there is a line that you want to cut along for the right front bodice. You're just gonna cut a strip of fabric off, and that is gonna be the side that you attach the sewn on placket to. And my fabric actually is the same on the front and the back, but for the purpose of demonstration, I'm gonna show you how to do a sewn on placket. Now on the left front bodice, when worn, I'm gonna be doing the fold over placket. And I went ahead and interfaced and pre-pressed the folds for that placket. And I'll just edge stitch along both sides of that placket on the left front bodice. So we're gonna set that side of the bodice aside, and I'm gonna grab the right front bodice when worn and lay that face up, right side facing up. And then I'm gonna grab my placket piece, and I have already interfaced this. I don't know if you can see it. It is kind of hard to tell, but I basically interfaced one side of the placket, and I'm gonna lay that right sides together with the bodice with the interfaced part along the center front bodice. And I'm gonna sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance along the entire length of the front bodice. Next, I'll just lay the bodice right side up and press the placket away from the bodice. Then I'll flip that over, and I'm gonna press a 5/8 inch fold along this raw edge. And you can use a seam gauge for this. I kind of eyeball it. I feel like I've been doing this long enough. I can pretty quickly determine the right seam allowance just because I've done a lot of these projects. But if you're unsure, just use your tape measure or a seam gauge to make sure you get it nice and straight. And then I'm also going to trim and grade this seam allowance here from where I sewed the placket on. And grading basically means that you're cutting either side of the seam allowance to a slightly different width so that it lays a little bit more flat and reduces the bulk in the seam allowance. Then I'm just gonna fold that placket in half and match up the edge of the placket with the seam where I sewed the placket to the bodice. I did for the fold over placket on the left front bodice, I'm going to edge stitch either side of the placket. When you're done, both bodices should be symmetrical and the same size. This is the sewn on placket here. You can see it's got a fold on both sides of the placket. And then this is the grown on placket. And so on one side it doesn't have that fold. Next I can work on sewing the darts. When I get to the end of the dart point, I'm just going to tie a knot in the end of the dart instead of back stitching to lock the stitch. One thing I actually forgot to do, I'm going to do it right now, is stay stitch the neckline and the armholes of both the front and the back bodice. This is going to prevent the garment from stretching out while we are assembling everything and possibly trying it on. So it's just going to kind of stabilize those areas, since those areas are cut on the curve, which means they're also kind of cut on the bias and they are more prone to stretching out. So we're just about ready to sew the bodice pieces together. The last thing I want to do before we do that is prep the back bodice. So on the neckline of the back bodice, there's going to be 2 notches for version A. Version B has a different set of notches because it's a slightly different situation back there. But for version A, you're just going to fold this right sides together, match up those notches. You're basically folding it right in half. So the fold will be at the center back. And then you're going to stitch straight down from those notches, which are about 1 inch away from the center back, about 3 inches down, so maybe about right there. Then you'll just flatten out that fold to create a box pleat, and you'll stitch across the top of that to hold it in place. One of the things about this button-up shirt that makes it different from a traditional button-up shirt is that there is not a yoke on the back bodice. And this makes it a little bit easier to construct, and you don't have to worry about doing all the flipping and the burrito method and all that. But you still get that extra ease across the shoulders with this little pleat situation. Now, if you do want to modify this shirt and add a yoke, I do have a blog post over on my website, patternscoutstudio.com. I'll put a link to that down in the description that shows you how to modify the back bodice to add a yoke. Now I can start sewing the front bodice to the back bodice, and I'm actually going to do this with French seams. So what I'm going to do is flip this over so that the wrong side is facing up, and then I'm going to put these wrong sides together first. And then I'll sew those first with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'll trim the seam allowance in half, flip the bodice wrong side out so that right sides are touching, press the shoulder seam again, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam to complete the French seam. And then we'll have this really nice finished seam on the interior of the bodice. And I'll just press those seams toward the back bodice. So now we want to do the sleeve placket. So I've got my sleeve piece wrong side facing up, and I'm actually going to put a mark on this so that I know that this is the wrong side, because my fabric is the same on both sides. So I'm going to put a big X there with this heat soluble pin. All right, this piece looks a little rough because I've used it a lot, but on the bottom of the sleeve piece, you have 2 notches here, 2 small notches that are for the pleat that's going to go at the bottom of the sleeve before we attach it to the cuff. Then we have this line here that is for the location of the placket, and it's actually this way on this particular piece. But when you cut out the sleeve, you don't want to cut this slit just yet. So I kind of cut a notch. I cut a notch a little bit longer just so I know that that is the part where I want to put the placket on. So I did cut that notch bigger. And you want to take your placket piece, which I have already interfaced here. I didn't show that in the beginning. I kind of forgot to cut it out. But anyway, I've got my placket piece, this little rectangular piece, and I've interfaced the wrong side of this. So I'm also going to place this wrong side facing up. So this is wrong side facing up, and the placket piece is wrong side facing up. And there's a little notch at the bottom of the placket piece that needs to line up with the notch for the placket location. You also want the taller side of the placket to be next to these two little notches. So that's how you can kind of remember. So I'm just going to kind of put that back together. I kind of cut my notch a little too long actually. And I'm going to line up the notches there. I also just want to draw myself a line so you can see here. I just want to draw a line here, and then I'm going to stitch around the perimeter of that line. I'm just going to line that up, and I'm going to draw myself a line, and I'm just going to stop at about 1/4 inch below the top of the placket piece here. This is going to be my guide for sewing. So I've marked my line here. There's the notch. It lines up with the notch for the placket, and then there are the two notches to the side there for the sleeve pleat. Okay, and I've got the long edge of the placket next to those two notches. So now I'm going to pin this in place. And I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch allowance around this line that I drew. So I'm basically going to sew all the way up, pivot and turn, and then come back down 1/4 inch away from this little line. So I'll just use the edge of my presser foot as a guide because I know that this is about 1/4 inch here to the edge of the presser foot, and I'll just line up that line with the edge of my presser foot. I got my stitching here around the perimeter of that, and then I'm just going to cut both the placket and the sleeve along the red line here, the line that I drew earlier. I'm just going to snip all the way along there, and I'm going to stop about 1/4 inch from the top, and I'm going to clip into the corners right up to the stitching, but not through the stitching, like so. This is where things get a little bit kind of tiny and finicky, but I'm going to fold each side over about 1/8 of an inch and press that. And then I'm going to flip this over to the right side. This is the right side of fabric now, and I'm going to pull this placket through the slit to the right side like that, and I'm going to press that down. Now I'm going to fold this shorter side here back over this opening, and I'm going to press it in half like so, and align this fold with the stitch here where the placket was attached in the first step. So I'm just going to fold that there. And then I'm just going to edge stitch along the fold here to secure this part, this folded part, in place. So we have this top stitch down now. This is still the right side of fabric. Here's the other side of that placket. This is the part that we just stitched down. That's what it looks like on the interior. So now we need to finish the other side of the placket. So we're going to basically do the same thing. I'm going to fold this back, fold it in half, and just barely cover that stitch line. I'm going to give that a press. And then now I'm going to open that back up, and I'm going to fold this in the opposite direction, right along that fold, like so. And I'm just going to stitch across the top of this with 1/4 inch seam allowance, just the top. And I also want to pull this away from the sleeve, so I'm just stitching the top of the placket. So again, I'm going to fold this over, right sides together, and I'm going to stitch across the top of that, keeping the sleeve out of the way. So now I can go in and trim this down. I'm just going to clip the corner and kind of trim off some of this excess here. And I'm going to flip this right side out, like so. And yes, I'm using my scissors to poke this out. Don't do this. That corner nice and pressed out. So now I've got that corner pressed out. Now I'm just going to fold this back over that opening, like so, making sure that my folded edge here is aligned with the stitch, because this is where we folded it before. Press that there, give it a good press. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right here so that I just catch the top of this side of the placket. So I'm going to start my stitch by going across the top, then up and over, and then all the way down this other side here, making sure that I'm not sewing the placket together. I just want to sew it to the shirt here on this side. Scissors to kind of poke that little bit of little edge in. So a nice, neat finish. And then when I come down the side here, I want to make sure I keep this piece pulled out of the way so that I'm just stitching the side of the placket here to the shirt. And if you're feeling a little fancy, you can do a little cross stitch across the square here. See how that now is all nice and neat finished. I'm going to give this a really good press. And that's our finished sleeve placket. Here's how it looks on the other side. All right, now we are ready to start working on the sleeves. So whenever I'm doing a set-in sleeve, I just like to sew it with a regular straight stitch and finish the seam allowance with a serger. It's just more comfortable, it's easier to sew. You can do a French seam on a set-in sleeve, but it's just a little bit more finicky, and I just don't like doing it. So anyway, I'm not gonna do it. So what I'm gonna do is lay the bodice face up. I'm just gonna open up the entire bodice so that the arm side is fully opened up and I can attach the sleeve. So I recently saw a tutorial on YouTube for a method of sewing a set-in sleeve called scrunching. I have never tried this. I'm going to attempt it here today for the very first time and see if it's any easier than the traditional method of creating little gathers in the top of the sleeve cap. So anyway, I'm gonna grab one of my sleeves. The sleeves have notches on them. There's a single notch for the front part of the sleeve. There's a double notch for the back part of the sleeve. So I'm gonna wanna put this right size together with the bodice. Again, my fabric is the same on both the front and the back, so it doesn't really matter. I just wanna make sure that I get those notches aligned in the correct spot. Now for the scrunching method, I can't remember the name of the channel, but I will find it. I'll link it down below. She said to first sew the underarm curve to the bodice first, but leave the sleeve cap unsewn, and then we'll go in and do the scrunching method. She also was sewing a set-in sleeve to a bodice that had already had the side seam closed. I usually don't close my side seam until after the sleeve is attached. I find it's just a little bit easier to get the sleeve in. So I'm gonna try to do it her way without closing up the side seam. So we'll see how it goes. So I'm just gonna align the back of the sleeve with the back bodice, starting at the side seam and going up to the notches, and sew that in place. And I'll do the same thing for the front bodice and the front part of the sleeve. And I'll sew it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance since I'm not doing the French seam on this seam. I've got that sewn. This is the sleeve cap here. This is the shoulder. And now I need to fit the top of the sleeve cap into the shoulder of the bodice. Now, one of the things that makes it tricky to sew a set-in sleeve is that the sleeve cap is a little bit longer than the edge of the shoulder. But that's just because the seam allowance, the addition of the seam allowance is a little bit longer on that outer curve than it is at the actual seam line. And so you have to kind of ease in the sleeve. And a lot of times what people will do for a set-in sleeve is sew 2 rows of basting stitches and then kind of slightly gather those. And it just makes it easier to kind of scrunch that sleeve into the opening. But then once you sew it, if you're sewing it along the correct seam allowance line, you shouldn't have any gathers and it should fit just fine. But it's just kind of working that extra seam allowance into the edge of the shoulder that gets a little tricky. So hopefully this method is easier and works, because setting in a sleeve is a really frustrating sewing technique and it's not really the most fun unless you just really like that kind of thing. But anyway, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna try the scrunching technique. So basically what she did was sew what I will call a stay stitch along the sleeve cap, but she places her finger behind the presser foot so that it kind of scrunches up the fabric as it goes under the presser foot and as it sews under the needle. So she doesn't let the fabric move past the presser foot. And this little scrunching technique creates a little bit of an accordion fold, and it makes it easier to kind of spread that into the top of the shoulder without doing the gathering stitches. So let's just see if it works. So I want to make sure I have that bodice flipped out of the way so that just the sleeve cap is exposed. I'm gonna do this just inside the seam allowance. So there's the scrunched up fabric, but it's not actually gathered, it's just scrunched. So I'm gonna carefully find the center of the top of the cap, sleeve cap. So there's the notch for the center top. Align that with the shoulder seam. I'm just gonna gently place that inside the sleeve. And then I'll just finish sewing that to the arm side. And I have to say that actually was a little bit easier than doing the gathering method. I will definitely be doing that from now on. Now, another little thing that I also like to do when I'm sewing on a sleeve, especially a set-in sleeve, is first sew it with a basting stitch. So I'm gonna set my stitch length to the longest length. I don't know if you can see that. So I got a 6 here on my machine. And then I'm gonna first sew that in with the long basting stitch. That way, if I have any kind of gathers or bunches in there, I can easily fix those. So I'll just check the sleeve, make sure I don't have any gathers sewn in, which it looks pretty good. Looks good. Now I'm gonna sew it at the right seam allowance with a regular straight stitch set to my normal stitch length, which is about 2 to 3 millimeters. I really like that method a lot. That was a lot easier. So now I'm just gonna take this over to the serger and finish off the seam allowance. If you do get any little small puckers like this, sometimes you can just kind of wiggle them out. If you get any big ones, you can go through and just kind of seam rip just that area and kind of, again, do a little wiggle and press with your fingers and then resew it. I always take my time with the set-in sleeves, even though it's kind of frustrating and I want to go fast. I just let myself slow down a little bit and, you know, make sure I get a nice smooth seam. I just want to press that seam allowance toward the bodice and away from the sleeve. All right, so now we have the sleeves inserted. That is one of the hardest steps out of the way. So glad that's done. Now that we have the sleeves attached, we can sew the sleeve seam and the side seam. So I'm gonna do a French seam on this again, and I'm gonna first put these wrong sides together, start at the sleeve hem, work my way down to the armpit and down to the hem of the blouse, flip everything wrong side out, and then sew that seam again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to complete the French seam. So you may notice that my sleeve does not have a placket. That is because I forgot to install the placket, and I actually did the placket tutorial part of this video after I'd already sewed the sleeve. So anyway, you do want the placket in before the sleeve goes in. Okay, so I've got the main shirt sewn together. Overall, I'm happy with the way this is coming together. I think I'm gonna get so much use out of this, but I'm getting a little tired of sewing today, so I'm gonna take a break, and then tomorrow I'll come back and start working on the finishing details. Now, this is one of those projects that starts out a little easier than it finishes because a lot of the finishing details happen toward the end. So we've still got a little bit of work to do on this shirt, but I promise it'll be worth it. Sewing a button-up shirt is such a rewarding project. So anyway, I'm gonna take a break. The dogs are circling like little sharks at my feet. They want me to stop working today. So yeah, we'll finish this shirt eventually.